Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 12. We're getting near the end of the semester. I'm not sure I'm ready for that, but here we go. I want to jump right in today to tell a story that may shed some light on the reading and discussion for this week. As I think most of you know by now, I've been a teacher for a very long time, depending on how I count it, nearly 50 years. I have been over those years essentially two kinds of teachers. In both types, and I think this is important, I was motivated by a desire to be a good teacher. I really wanted to be a good, effective teacher. The first and the earliest time of teaching, good teacher meant following the rules as closely and as carefully as I could. And I could tell a bunch of embarrassing stories about those years that fortunately didn't last too long, thanks to a mentor named Harry, whom I'd also like to tell you about, but no time for that. The second and most recent type, and the longest type, would boil down to saying, well, ignoring the rules, at least the rules that I could ignore and hope not to get caught. I would generically characterize the first as I teach a subject and the second as I teach students. The first kind of teacher assumes that all students are basically the same, a one-size-fits-all approach. The second assumes that no students are the same, that they come equipped differently, different life experiences, different home lives, and, well, you get the point. They're not the same, no matter how much they may generically dress like the same. I could tell you a few stories about how and why I transitioned from the one to the other, beginning with a story about Harry, but only one will suffice, and a fairly recent one because it's the most current example of what I'm trying to illustrate. Over the years, most of my students were generally like me, that is, white and middle class. Because I spent most of my teaching career in church-related schools, most were also Christian, or at least identified as Christians. Very few non-Christians, very few students of color, very few non-Westerners. Sadly, I could assume a lot about my students. I was rarely threatened by deep differences. In the last several years, however, while I was teaching at Warner Pacific University in Portland, the diversity of the student population increased fairly dramatically. And I had several students of color, many of whom fell into that broader category of Hispanic Latino. And because most of those were also first-generation students, they were more closely tied to family cultural traditions, some quite different from my own. Fortunately for them and for me, it had emerged already as that second kind of teacher. By the way, I like to call that kind of teacher a relational teacher. That is, I'm teaching students, also known as persons, human beings, and persons who bring to the table a great deal of richness that I need to provide space for. So when one of my Latina students said that she would be missing class for a week, possibly more, because a relative had died. And now my frame of reference, I would define this person as a distant relative. The first kind of teacher would have been a rule enforcer. The second was a help me to understand what's going on kind of teacher. Family, aka familia, was defined and understood differently in her culture. There were no distant relatives. There was familia, and she was expected, and I underscore and embold that in print, to attend all the events surrounding the death of this person. What am I to do? While this isn't primarily a theological question in this context, it does illustrate what Tanner, the author of this essay, is talking about. When life throws the church a curve, how do we respond? You know, there are all kinds of challenges in the ecclesiastical world. To name a few, the wide range of emerging definitions of human sexuality, the complicated world of mental health, the questions surrounding church and state, the autism spectrum, even the emerging idea of how church is to be defined. How does a local congregation deal with such a list that is already at its doorstep, if not already sitting in its pews in that immediate community of faith? What about the practice of hospitality in relationship to these diverse populations? This presents the local congregation with a challenging and deeply theological problem. Confronted by the challenge of a conflict with cultural norms, what did I do? I consulted folks more knowledgeable about the matter. I also thought about it in terms of what I believed about people, hospitality, learning, what Jesus taught. I read and I studied. And, most significantly, I sat down with this young woman, and we found a way to mutually and satisfactorily accommodate the demands of the course and the demands of her different than my and different than the institutional cultural norms, and at the same time learned a great deal about navigating these waters. I would just briefly mention, just kind of in passing, because I could spend a great deal of time on this as well, the story of Paul and the question about Gentile Christians and the ancient practice of circumcision. The question, simply put, was, must Gentiles be circumcised? That is, become in the flesh Jews in order to become Christians. This was a major cultural challenge in the world of the early church. Few churches, if any, are going to avoid the challenges that I've named. How the churches address theological and biblical teachings, shifting cultural norms, Christian practices, will have much to say about the future of the Christian church. I look forward to reading your responses to what I consider to be a really good essay and a major challenge for the contemporary church. Continued traveling mercies on your journey.